Hi everyone. Which is the camera for our online audience? Is it this one? This is our first attempt at a blended event, so yeah, apologies if the camera's in slightly interesting places. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Jess Hunt, the Deputy Director at TASO. Thanks to everyone who's here in person and to our online audience for joining us for the launch of our mental health report. We're really pleased to be sharing the findings on Mental Health Awareness Week and really hope that they'll contribute to not only raising awareness, but supporting more evidence-based practice to support better student outcomes in relation to mental health. The session today will run for about 1.5 hours. We're going to start with a presentation from my colleague Sarah Chappell, and then we have 3 short presentations from our excellent panel members. We've got Nancy Hay, the Exec Director from What Works Wellbeing, Nikasi Stoll, co-founder and co-director of Black Students Talk, which features in our report that Sarah will be talking about, and Elizabeth Mullinger, who is a mature student at Coventry Uni. Before we start, I'll give a brief context as to how this research came about. In July last year, TASO published a report which summarised a sector consultation exercise that we undertook with the HE sector. And this indicated that mental health was really a priority area for HE providers in terms of learning what works, to be able to improve student outcomes and embedding those practices. So in response, TASO launched a work stream which focuses specifically on mental health and disability and embedded this within our research and evaluation programme. All of our work follows a 3-stage evidence cycle where we start by commissioning a gaps analysis piece of work. The focus of that is to kind of really diagnose the state of the evidence base and the extent to which interventions to improve student outcomes have been evaluated. And those are the findings that Sarah will be talking through today. Following the gaps analysis, we intend to kind of play a much more active role in supporting the generation of new evidence and kind of informing the sector of what works in an attempt to kind of scale up best practice. And I think some ideas as to what that research might focus on will come up in the conversation today. So in the meantime, I'll hand over to Sarah to present the kind of key findings from our work.
Hi everyone, morning. I just want to double check the online audience can definitely hear us okay. Good, perfect. So yeah, it's great to see so many of you in person, but I know we've got a lot more watching online and I need to remember to look over at that camera. So yeah, thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it's a Monday morning, but it is Mental Health Awareness Week, so it's a great time to present on our findings. So I just want to sort of kick off by just saying a huge thank you to the Centre for Education and Youth. So Alex is here with us today, and I know Ellie will be joining us shortly. So TASO commissioned the Centre for Education and Youth, CFEY, to carry out the report, which involved an evidence review as well as a consultation with the sector. So thank you for being here today, and I'll just be presenting sort of on the context, the actual methodology, as well as some sort of key findings and recommendations. Oh, Ellie's just joined us from CFEY. Sorry for announcing that, Ellie. So in terms of the context, I think we're well aware that this isn't an under-researched area by any means. It's quite a saturated research area, so we really didn't want to replicate what others had done. So for example, there is existing evidence from the What Works Wellbeing Centre. So Nancy is here today and she'll be presenting a little bit later on that. So they have carried out a review of review-level evidence. So we are aware to some extent what interventions exist to support student mental health and what works to some extent for student mental health. So what we wanted to do with our current report is focus more on what works for whom. So with TASO, we've been set up to close equality gap. So it's really important that we understand how mental health might be exacerbating or contributing to equality gaps. And also what interventions are in place to attempt to close those equality gaps. And we also wanted to focus on the impact on HE-related outcomes. So there's quite a lot of evidence in terms of supporting well-being, supporting mental health outcomes, but not so much in terms of those longer-term outcomes and the impact on things like attainment, dropout rates, progression to postgraduate study and to employment. So that's what we really wanted to focus on with this report as well. So in terms of what we did, to start with, it was very much an overview of the evidence landscape, so particularly what the prevalence was for mental health issues and in particular for specific subgroups of students. What predicts mental health issues or poor mental health in university or in HE, and also what protective factors there are. We then carried out a review of different interventions with a specific focus on the impact on different target groups, so different at-risk groups of students. And then finally, it was a consultation with the sector. So this took the form of a survey as well as roundtable discussions. And there was over 30 participants, different stakeholders from the HE sector, and they did come from a range of different provider types. So, for example, we grouped the roundtable discussions by FE colleges, by small and specialist providers, by Russell Group universities, by post-92 universities, and also third sector organisations and charities. So I'll come to the findings a little bit later, but just wanted to give you sort of overview of what we actually did as part of the report. So coming on to the evidence to start with, so looking at prevalence of mental health, it's clear that mental health issues are more prevalent in certain groups of students than others. So certain groups of students are more at risk of having poor mental health while in higher education. So those are students from low socioeconomic status, students from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, mature students, students who identify as LGBTQ+, and care leavers, so students who've had experience of care. So these students are more likely to have poor mental health whilst at university, but as we know sort of from the widening participation sector, we know that these students are more likely to have poorer HE outcomes as well. So in terms of attainment, in terms of retention, in terms of progression, as well as actual entry into HE. So it's likely that these mental health issues are sort of exacerbating or contributing to inequalities that we already have between disadvantaged students and advantaged students. So in terms of predictive and protective factors, these may not be completely new to anyone, and they obviously do make sense and are quite obvious in this sense, but predictive factors, so predictors of mental health, our mental health literacy, so obviously understanding your own mental health, understanding what impacts your well-being is a really important factor which is predictive of your mental health. Also help-seeking behaviour, so not just in terms of seeking support for any mental health issues, but in terms of academic support as well, so being comfortable and confident to be able to seek help when it's needed. And also having social skills and that social network around you is a key predictor of mental health. In terms of protective factors, they're very much in line with what we'd expect as well. So having that sort of sense of belonging in HE is really important to protect your mental health. Having resilience, being satisfied with your course, being satisfied with your environment in HE is really important. And also having that support network. So sense of belonging and a support network is really key to protect your mental health. So in terms of the evidence, I've sort of split it up into different sections. So the first of all is around disclosure and help-seeking behaviour. So male students and students from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds in particular are both less likely to declare a mental health issue prior to entering HE, but also seek support whilst in HE. So a lot of this comes from UCAS data, but also research from Mind, the mental health charity. So yeah, they're more likely to experience poor mental health, these types of students, but less likely to actually seek support or get help for that. And a lot of reports suggest things like discrimination, not having enough diversity of staff, segregation of accommodation. There's a few issues that are cited, which means that certain students feel that they have poor mental health while at university but don't actually seek the support. There's sort of that lack of trust there to seek support. And on that note, there's just a lack of research and evidence around interventions which are effective in actually encouraging these students to seek support. So there's a lot of evidence or quite a lot of research that's been done on the student experience and how students are feeling in HE, but less so on actual interventions which encourage those to disclose issues or also to seek support. So that's what we're missing there. So in terms of the actual interventions, the studies and the evidence was categorised into TASO and the OFS typology. So those of you that are familiar with TASO might be well aware of this, but we split evidence into sort of type 1, which is narrative evidence, type 2, which is empirical inquiry, and type 3 is causal. So this causal evidence is what we want. So it's showing us that there's a direct link between an intervention and mental health outcomes. So you can see from the table that most of the studies are actually of quite a good standard in terms of being empirical and causal. So it shows, like I said at the beginning, that there is quite a lot of evidence out there in terms of interventions. So what we wanted to do is sort of pick apart the evidence here and see what actually is working for whom. So in terms of evidence impact, intervention impact, again, this is sort of corroborated by previous research that there's a lot of empirical evidence and causal evidence for these psychological interventions. So that might include cognitive behavioural therapy as well as mindfulness-based interventions. So this is something that's been found in previous research, and it makes sense because it's the sort of interventions that are used the most in sort of larger institutions and are easier to evaluate for that reason. So they're sort of larger scale interventions which can be rolled out. But also technology-based interventions. Obviously, we've been expecting a surge of these post-pandemic, but there's definitely a good amount of evidence for technology-based interventions as well. So particularly showing that through personalisation, they can be more effective. So this is in particular for apps, so certain mental health apps that are within institutions, but also running the types of interventions, so psychological and mindfulness-based interventions in an online format or in a virtual format. But what we're really missing, which is obviously a shame because the focus of our research was really to focus on these long-term outcomes, but there's really a lack of research on the longer-term impact of these interventions. So on the whole, they're measured in a short-term way. On the whole, they measure well-being and specific mental health outcomes, but there's a lack of research on interventions which look further at that and look at attainment, look at retention, look at progression. That just doesn't seem to be something that's done very often in the evaluation of these interventions. So that's what we're really missing. So what the main focus of our report, as I've said, is sort of focusing on targeted support. So focusing on specific at-risk groups that are more likely to have mental health issues. So what are interventions doing to target these specific groups? So again, there's this. It's worth noting actually to start with that there's a real lack of evidence around interventions targeting specific at-risk groups. So on the whole, these interventions seem to be rolled out to the student population as a whole. They're aimed to be more wide-reaching rather than specifically focusing on target populations or specific at-risk groups. But there was some studies that did look specifically at this sort of targeted support and supporting these at-risk groups. So, for example, cognitive behavioural therapy and not mindfulness-based interventions had been adapted to support specific issues. So this might be around students who identify as LGBTQ+. So there's a programme called Being Out with Strength, which uses cognitive behavioural therapy, and it's very much focused for a specific group of students. And also using mindfulness to reduce race-related trauma. So there is some really specific interventions going on, but on the whole, they're sort of more wide-reaching to the whole student population. So what's come out mainly from our report is that peer support initiatives, particularly, so peer mentoring, peer-led interventions, peer support, lends themselves to supporting specific subgroups of students. So there's a real emerging evidence base for these types of interventions to be used for specific student groups. So, for example, so our panelist speaker, Nakasi Stoll, is going to be speaking around a particular intervention called Black Students Talk, which is very much based on peer support and peer mentoring. So obviously there's staff in place to facilitate these things, but on the whole, it's these sort of peer support mechanisms which seem to be most effective for supporting specific student groups. But there is a huge lack of evidence for particular groups. So we've got some examples of targeted support for students from different ethnic minorities, and we do for students of different sexualities, different genders, but there seems to be a lack of evidence for mature learners in particular and students from low SES backgrounds, so low socio-economic status backgrounds. So that's really what's coming out. So there is some sort of targeted support going on. There is these new interventions which are working really hard to focus on specific at-risk groups, but there is a lot of groups that are still missing, and obviously there's more that needs to be done. So those are sort of the main findings that's come out of the evidence review. So now just going to move on to the sector consultation part. So as I mentioned sort of in the introduction, it was around 30 stakeholders from different institutions, a wide range of different institutions. They took part in a survey, but also went into more detail during round table discussions, which are sort of set up based on their provider type. So for example, a round table discussion just for stakeholders from FE colleges. So sort of continuing with similar themes that came out from the evidence review, there was agreement from stakeholders that disclosure was an issue and help-seeking behaviour was an issue, and that some groups of students are less likely to disclose and seek support than others. So some examples that they came up with was Black, Asian and minority ethnic students. They said that there was a sort of lack of trust from students due to discrimination, due to institutional racism. They didn't feel comfortable seeking help or disclosing that they had any concerns. Another example is refugees and asylum seekers. So there's a lot of cultural barriers to disclosing. So I've worked at an international college before, and I'm in a sort of student support mental health role, and I'm very aware that for some students from different cultures, it's not okay. It's not seen as okay to talk about mental health or disclose that. For LGBTQ plus students, there was issues around sort of their sexuality and their identity and not feeling ready to speak to anyone else about this at any point, not wanting to seek help in that sense. And for male students in particular, so we've seen that through the data as well, that there's sort of lower levels of disclosure, more levels of underreporting, and this is likely due to stigma. So the sort of negative connotations associated with mental health and revealing that you have a mental health issue is still very much there for male students in particular. And for low socio-economic status students, some themes that were coming up were sort of fear of losing opportunities or wanting to be strong for their family. So they might have been the first in their family to go to higher education, and they didn't want to admit to having any issues or not being successful in HE in terms of their mind. So they didn't feel comfortable to be able to disclose a mental health concern. So in terms of targeted support from the sector consultation, we saw quite a bit of mismatch between what is going on within higher education providers and what's actually seen in the literature. So from the literature, we saw that there was sort of hardly any targeting of support, whereas what we actually found through the consultation with the sector is that there is a lot of targeting going on within providers. So they're aware that there's specific at-risk groups that they believe need more support than others, and they're doing quite a lot to support those students, which is great. It's just not being represented in the literature. So some examples that came up were some specific transition programs. So these are for care experience students, and it was a way for them to enroll and sort of be on campus and network with others before the sort of usual induction week. So specifically for seeking support and signposting where to go to for support for care experienced students. There's particular networks, so for care leavers, for young carers, with a designated point of contact who's a student and a staff member, and signposting to relevant interventions. So peer support and peer mentoring came up a huge amount, so there's a lot of different support networks specifically around mental health and well-being for a lot of different groups, so ranging from interfaith networks to try and support students who come from different religious backgrounds, but also students from different ethnicities. LGBTQ plus was a key feature. So there's a lot of this sort of peer support and mentoring programs going on that are being well facilitated by staff. And also some specific sort of workshops and courses that are given to specific at-risk student groups, and work with local charities, so particular providers mentioned a BAME charity that they were working with to provide specific support to their students as well. So there's a lot of this sort of targeted support going on, but as I said, it's not being represented in the literature. So the next point was sort of around the challenges. So I'm sure people in the room and online will be well aware of particular challenges in providing mental health support, and we by no means wanted to ignore them for this sort of report and presentation. So particularly by provider type, so small and specialist providers, FE colleges in particular, have a lot of issues in terms of resourcing, funding. They're able to offer some mental health support, but on the whole they have to base it on referrals. They're unable to sort of do specific targeted support. It's more sort of trying to reach as many students as possible. So provider type really did make an impact. Small and specialist providers as well sort of mentioned that what sector-wide initiatives didn't really translate well to their sort of smaller providers as well. So just being aware that it's very context dependent in terms of what support can be provided. In terms of sharing of data, so if students left one institution and went to another, or if they're coming up through school or college into higher education, there was a real lack of sharing of data, which made it difficult to sort of identify the students that needed the most support. A common theme was around the student life cycle. So we know that students have long holiday breaks, so it just meant in terms of accessing support in term time, the matching up of timing just didn't seem to work in terms of wait lists and things like that. So there's a mismatch there that wasn't quite working for a lot of students. This idea of merging support, so academic staff don't feel well equipped to deal with mental health, to deal with well-being issues, believe it's not necessarily in their remit, or they don't feel qualified enough to be able to deal with it. So there's this lack of sort of merging of support or communication between student support departments and academic departments. And there's challenges in terms of having a whole institutional approach. So I think a lot of the stakeholders that were in the consultation really advocated for a sort of whole institution approach, an inclusive by design approach, but it just wasn't something that was always possible to have buy-in from every sort of section of the institution. And also challenges around transition. So on the whole, providers felt that transition into HE was reasonably good. There's support on offer. They provided quite a lot of support for students entering HE, but in terms of students then moving on to postgraduate study, moving into employment, changing courses, moving institution, taking a break from HE and then returning, there was just a lot of gaps that they were noticing in the support that they could offer. And finally, moving on to evaluation. So on the whole, providers said that they were measuring whether their interventions worked, generally through qualitative student feedback and student surveys as well, measuring well-being. So obviously it's brilliant that you can get an in-depth information from students on how they're doing with the intervention and whether it's working for them. But there was a real lack of sort of more robust evidence taking place. And providers mainly cited a sort of lack of skills, lack of resources, lack of knowledge to be able to carry out this sort of intervention. As we've mentioned previously, there's a real lack of evidence of the impact of interventions on HE-related outcomes. So in some cases, providers did follow students' journey to see how they did in terms of attainment, progression, but on the whole that was largely missing from evaluation. There was also this idea that type 3 evidence or causal evidence, such as randomised controlled trials, was seen as inappropriate. So there seems to be pushback on the sector as to whether that's an acceptable way to evaluate interventions. And also there was a worry around capturing feedback from students. So typically the most engaged students are actually responding on the intervention, so you're not getting sort of a generalised view of exactly what's happening with these interventions for all students. So moving on finally to sort of recommendations. I think it's quite obvious that there's gaps in the research and we need more research to take place. So in particular, encouraging disclosure. So we know UCAS and Student Minds are doing a lot of great work on how to promote disclosure and how to improve disclosure, but we do know that sort of 50% of students aren't disclosing a mental health issue when they apply to HE. So more research on how we can encourage disclosure, but also encourage help-seeking behaviour once students are actually in HE is really important. So the framing of support is really important. So some sort of A/B testing or discourse analysis on the framing of support would be really useful. I think we've seen a growth in technology-based interventions, particularly since the pandemic. A lot of support that was offered face-to-face has now moved online, and some providers have kept that going, but we don't have the long-term impact of whether this is working and whether this is reaching all marginalised group and impacting students in the same way. And again, we just need more research on interventions to support at-risk groups. So we know there's some out there. We know that some current interventions are being adapted for specific at-risk groups. But to close the equality gaps, we do need more of that. Which leads on to sort of peer support initiatives. So we know that there's issues around disclosure and help-seeking behaviours. We know students have many barriers to actually disclosing and seeking help. So it looks like peer support initiatives are the way forward to try and tackle that issue around disclosure and help seeking. So those that have a lack of trust, don't feel comfortable with their peers, they are likely to feel more comfortable. So these interventions are really helpful there. The timeline issue that I mentioned, so in terms of not marrying up and waiting lists and things like that. So student networks, student support networks can be available sort of all year round. So it helps that issue in some sense as well. And they really lend themselves to supporting specific groups. So that's the great thing about peer support initiatives. They can really help specific student groups and can be set up in a number of different ways. But we're very much lacking sort of causal evidence for these initiatives. So we've got some great emerging evidence for these initiatives, but we're lacking sort of some robust evaluation on the long-term impacts of these initiatives. And finally, just in terms of evaluation, I've flagged before that we do need more longer-term HE-related outcomes. So we need it to be more of a given when you're evaluating mental health interventions, that you do look at the long-term impact as well on not just mental health and well-being outcomes, but also on HE-related outcomes, so attainment, retention, and progression. And I'm well aware that that's a challenge, and that stakeholders feel they're under-resourced to be able to deliver these sorts of evaluations. So I really think this is where TASO can add value in supporting providers and supporting stakeholders in how to evaluate their interventions and providing that guidance. We need more evidence of causality, so we need more of this type 3 evidence, specifically, as I said, for peer support initiatives. And finally, I think we need more of a sharing of what works, a pooling of knowledge, so that we can better support students and close those equality gaps. And that's me. Thank you. I'm just going to hand back over to Jess to introduce the panel.
Slightly redundant, it's up here on the screen, but Nancy Hay, the Executive Director at What Works Wellbeing, will be the first panel member to present today. So come on up. I think you can just flick through on these. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. Well, and it's brilliant to see this area of practice and research really growing. So that was one of the reasons I got involved in this area, is I was wanting to understand what makes a difference. And when we reviewed the evidence sort of from 2017 onwards, we wanted to see that accelerate, that research accelerate, and it already has. So this is me. I'm Nancy Hay. I'm the director at the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. We're the UK's national body for wellbeing evidence, policy and practice. We bring together what's known, get it out to those that can use it, and where there are evidence gaps, work together in partnership to fill them, which is why I am here today. And we work across sector, across all age groups, across the whole of the life course. It's the life course work that took us to this area. So if you look at the cohort studies that look at people's lives over time, we suddenly realise that while attainment is great, all these other things that we do and help people succeed in life are great, mental health was the area that was massively overlooked and had a huge impact all the way through the life course on how people did in their lives. And so this is where, and actually research on mental health had paused in terms of its increase from the 1970s onwards. So we've got 30 years plus of catch up to do on mental health research, which is why it's so fantastic to see this improving. And this matters. So this is young people's well-being over time. This is 10 to 15-year-olds since 2009. But this is important. These are our national stats collated by the Children's Society. But what's interesting here is that we can see that well-being at 14 is predictive of mental health problems in that really at-risk window in the late teens, early 20s, when you're often working with young people, and then later adult well-being at 34 and onwards. So this really matters. We're going in slightly the wrong direction. School work, surprisingly though, has not been the challenge. And what is fantastic is one of those protective things with the family has stayed the same mostly, but again, not for everybody. And this is where I love what you were doing about really getting into what works for whom, when, how, and how much. And we can see that this is slightly longer term outcomes, actually. This is the graduate outcome data. This is anxiety by graduate subject area that we can see. We can see this for happiness, we can see this for life satisfaction, we can see this for purpose, which is a slightly lower one. But this is why it matters that to really dig in a little bit more about what matters for whom, when, and how. And so this is just subject area. This isn't even dividing by different other population characteristics. And we can look at the impact we make. We know HE makes a massive impact on people's lives, to the well-being of the UK and to the people and population groups and places within it. We can start to understand that difference and do it much more systematically. And that systematic approach is what we did. We looked at a review of reviews of what works for student mental health and well-being. And this is the groundwork in 2018, which we started to move on. So loads of things, actually, we know, it turns out. We know loads of things work. This is brilliant news. It's way more than we expected. We know that a whole load of psychological interventions that work for the general population also work for the student population. This is fantastic. It also means that there are other things that work for the general population that would transfer brilliantly across. A whole load of things like psychoeducation also seems to work, and that's the sort of thing we were doing with student space during the pandemic, which had a massive acceleration because poor students didn't do so well in that time. We've also got some really exciting, promising things in terms of these recreational areas that look to be almost more impactful than some of the psychological interventions. And then some other more specific setting and suicide prevention based type things. Technology I was really pleased to see on there because the evidence was really mixed. So it's great to see that as that's accelerating, that's pushing forward. So we're starting to see that there are lots of things that we can do. But one of these things told us is that one, there's more known than we thought. So there's a lot of things that we can do and loads of things that are happening that really make a difference, and we can be much more robust about what we do and how we do it for which groups of people. But some things are more researched than others. And sometimes that's just because they're easier to research or the incentives are there. So loads of things that we already do, that you were hinting at from the practice examples, practice discussions, lots of things we already do that didn't show up in the research. And we should be researching those to really value what we're already doing as much as we're the new and exciting things that come in. And I think that's not in the literature. The link also between attainment and all these performance outcomes have been researched in the workplace, and it looks really promising. You can have interventions that improve well-being and that improve performance, but where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck is where they do both together. And one of the things you put up there was the whole institution approaches. And we can see from the workplace data, this is just a setting, right? Like any other, like a community or a place. When you integrate all of these initiatives into an overall approach, all of those things that aren't academic attainment, essentially, into an overall strategy, that is when you get performance improvements as well. And there's no reason why that doesn't translate across to this context as well, but we need to see if it actually does. So, two other things I wanted just to touch on from the evidence which you were hinted at here. So the things that help us with resilience are things that actually happen all the time in universities. So having adverse childhood experiences is a term that's used, but actually it's about life events that happen to people. Life happens different times. That trusted adult matters, and we can see in schools that trusted adult being a teacher matters. So that trusted adult, whether it's in any way, can make a difference. Having supportive friends came throughout what you were talking about, really makes a difference. And it also depends on what they're feeling about. And that weekly sport turns out really matters. So that recreation bit really, and the reason it matters because it boosts your mental health and well-being as you're doing it and has a long-term impact. So there's loads of things that universities do that we could actually pull back in a bit more as well. And that how it works is also important. So the reason I got into this is I looked at adult learning, and there's a whole load of things we can start to understand and test about. This is just a theory of change based on adult learning, and we can put values on these different amounts and the different things that come and how we can make the biggest difference. And that's when we can start to get much better causal information, when we start unpicking these and testing these different bits. So it's really exciting for me to see that this is getting much more specific about what we can do to help people who are in trouble, what we can do for those who are at risk, and then what we do overall to promote, and all the things that we already do as organisations that make a difference to the well-being of the people within them. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of the discussion about what we do for different groups of people to really get into more detail, to fill those evidence gaps so that we can accelerate that and make a biggest difference. So that's me, and I'm going to hand over, I think, now to you. Is that right? Yeah.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thank you for the other talks. They're really helpful to kind of like hear a kind of summary of the report. It was really, really lovely to kind of see that there's more research being done to kind of understand Black students' experiences, which is basically what I do every day of my life for the past couple of years. So just for like a little introduction to me, I guess, I'm Nikasi. I'm doing my PhD at King's College London. And it is a qualitative evaluation of Black students' mental health experiences. And basically, I just asked them to talk about their mental health and well-being to me all day, every day. And in 2020, we officially launched Black Students Talk. And Black Students Talk is basically a peer support intervention specifically for Black students to talk about their mental health and their life experiences and the things that impact them at university. And the reason myself and my co-founder, Yannick Yalepende, set up Black Students Talk is, to be honest, basically our mental health was rubbish during university. I can kind of speak to my own experience. I really, really struggled in my undergrad and master's. And it got to my master's level where I said, you know what, I am not continuing if I don't get any support. Tried to access university support and it wasn't for me. I didn't find it beneficial to speak to the person that I was paired with because I felt that a lot of my experiences were grounded in me struggling with racism at university. And the only support they had available was white counsellor staff. So tried to look up support that would help me. This was back in 2016, so a little while, a few years back now, and there was nothing available. I googled every single like keyword, absolutely nothing. So it is really lovely to hear that since 2016, more of this research is happening, and we're kind of talking about this. So yeah, our aims are basically to like challenge the unhelpful narratives around Black students' mental health and unpack our lived experiences that shape our mental health and our well-being. We want to increase awareness on Black students' mental health and well-being and what affects us. And also we just want to support each other, basically. It's pretty simple. It does what it does in the tin, really. We do peer support groups, and we do workshops, and we do evaluation and research, and we have consultancy. So we have groups that run within specific universities, and also over the pandemic, we were funded by Student Space to run the group nationally. So I'll today mostly be speaking about the results of research we did on the national peer support group. So just for some context, there was a drop-in online peer support group. Anyone who identified as a Black university student studying at undergrad, postgrad level across England and Wales were able to sign up to the groups. The topics of the groups were based on my PhD research and also some listening exercises we did with Black students to kind of understand what impacts them. We developed resources and the content of the peer support groups based on those listening groups in my PhD. And those cute little drawings you see, they're basically, we commissioned a Black student to design some lovely little digital art based on each of the topics. So this is just some of the topics that came up. If you're wondering why it wasn't me, because I'm not artistic, I'll tell you that. So some of the things that came up. So we did focus groups with the Black students who attended. We also did a survey. So Black students talk, why is it useful? Actually, no, I'll start with why they came, because I think that's probably something that's really important to talk about, if I can summarize it in a very quick 1 minute. So we asked students why they joined Black Students Talk. And the thing that came up the most, which was quite interesting for me specifically, was students talked about racism across the education pipeline. So students talked about experiences of racism from as young as reception here in the UK. They talked about some really awful experiences of being called racial slurs by their teachers, by the way, not fun, to kind of being openly discriminated in the classroom, from experiences of their teachers kind of grading them a lower grade because they just didn't think they were intelligent, and how that really impacted their mental health and well-being. And what those students kind of spoke about was that, racism doesn't start at university, They're dealing with the impact of racism across their kind of, you talk about life course, they're kind of dealing with racism across the life course. So by the time they get to university, they're just being re-traumatized from earlier experiences. So what they found useful with Black Students Talk is that it was a space where there was only people that looked like them, right? It was a Black-only space for the voiceless. They really found it beneficial to be able to talk to other students about their experiences and not feel like they had to over-explain themselves, to feel like they had a space to be able to unpack some of those experiences. When you're a child, you can't really verbalize, you don't have the language to be able to understand what's kind of happened. So by the time they get to university, they can't verbalize to someone that, this is a trauma that they're dealing with. So they really benefited from being able to unpack that with each other in that space. They also kind of found it really helpful to have resources that were based on kind of some of the evidence pulled from adult mental health, like the literature around like racial trauma and things in adult populations. I couldn't really find anything based on student populations. So it was based on adults, but they found it really helpful to kind of have those resources to be able to facilitate those discussions. One thing that I found really interesting in the report is you spoke a little bit about lower socioeconomic students. One thing that they kind of spoke about, which was beneficial, was having meeting people, basically, undergrad and postgrad students kind of from across different backgrounds basically came, and they found it really useful to have more opportunities for networking and like cultural capital and things like that. So a lot of the students kind of spoke about the fact that they kind of networked with each other, and they kind of left BST having people that they could collaborate with in projects or on research projects with, or just kind of set up little different other projects they've done at their own universities. And they found that really helpful to have that capital that Black students have kind of, well, in my research and in some other really key research studies have shown they don't have access to. So kind of for students who are from the lower socioeconomic backgrounds who maybe don't feel like they have that capital and that privilege that other students might have, they found it really helpful. So that was another really interesting, unexpected finding. Some quotes, but I don't think we have time to go through that. Okay, so there were some things that we thought were really useful that I kind of want to highlight before I kind of finish talking, because I can talk forever on this subject. There were some things that came out of the research that I think would be really useful to highlight. So if you want to kind of run peer support for Black students, it has to be created by and for Black university students. So we were supported very, very, very amazingly by the Student Minds and Student Space teams for funding, and they also helped us with things like just logistics that, you know, I'm a student, I'm not, I'm not a business owner or person, so it's really helpful to have kind of resources from them. But the actual design and the evaluation and the running of BST was by and for Black students. And I think the students kind of found that was really helpful and useful to kind of see those Black faces and just know that it was for them. Also, we need it to be funded by government charities and universities, because the one thing that we don't have is access to that intergenerational wealth and access to funding. Unfortunately, there's definitely inequalities in that. We need robust training for facilitators. So we train the facilitators ourselves, and the facilitators, when we asked them, they found that that training was vital to be able to, you know, they themselves kind of hold a lot of emotional labor when kind of running these groups, and they found it really helpful to have training and also to have reflective practice with a Black trauma therapist. So we hired a Black counsellor to run their supervision. That was very important because they themselves needed to unpack some of the things that were happening in that session. So again, that's quite vital. Yeah, it was useful for it to be online so that Black students could kind of network and liaise with students from across England and Wales. One thing that we're finding is that universities, a lot of the time, there is, of course, an underrepresentation of Black students at universities. So it's quite hard to be able to kind of bring together Black students to have this peer support group. So to do it nationally, to be able to go online and meet students from across the UK, especially for the students who are in kind of very remote areas in England and Wales, it's quite helpful to kind of have that opportunity to be online. They also kind of spoke about wanting the focus to be on promoting positive mental health and well-being. So rather than kind of focusing on the deficit model, kind of be able to, you know, talk about the strengths that the Black student community have, and yeah, encourage each other to support each other. Because I know that time, I'll just kind of leave it there for now. And yeah, I'll go to the... So yeah, future directions. I think this is something that's kind of been touched upon already, but we need further research, of course. We need further research to understand the lived experience of Black students from different identities and social status. So, you know, Black students are a monolith, but in a lot of the research that we've done, there isn't really a lot of research that kind of disaggregates students from different identities. We need to understand that a bit more. We also need to build community. We need to build a network and host community events and have more like conversations like this so that we can understand what's happening across the sector. And yeah, I think we need more spaces for reflective practice for the BSc team, but also for other people who are doing this work, because I think a lot of things that kind of gets missed out in these kind of interventions and other interventions that kind of look at marginalized identities is that we don't have a lot of time within our sector, the sector ourselves, people doing this work, to come together to reflect on how it impacts us as well, and how how we can kind of share knowledge and understanding. So that's me.
Thank you. And our final speaker for the day, before we go into the panel discussion, is Elizabeth Mullinger, a mature student from Coventry Uni.
Thank you. Is this still your... Do I just keep going? Just keep going. There we go. That's me. Yeah, thank you. Everything I've heard so far, like Nakasi said, it's just amazing to hear how many interventions are already happening, how much research has already taken place. It's very hopeful to hear. So every one of us has mental health. Good mental health facilitates positive thoughts, feelings and behaviours and can be incredibly empowering. But in contrast, poor mental health can block our ambition, our drive, understanding and empathy, especially towards ourselves. In life, the experiences, encounters and conversations that we have can transform how we think and feel. So I'm going to share how university has helped me to change my outlook and in turn change my life. So I'm Elizabeth, a mature student at Coventry University. Mature because it took me a long time to get here. In my early teens, I developed chronic depression, which, along with psychosis and high anxiety, caused memory complications and difficulties concentrating or grasping complex ideas quickly, things that I still deal with today, hence the script. Subsequently, at school, I performed really poorly in exams, in contrast to achieving high marks in written coursework. But I became so deterred by the reliance upon the end-of-year exams and the lack of well-being support and the impact of my deteriorating mental health that I dropped out of school at 16, truly believing that further education would never be an option for me. But I was always really envious of those who had been to university, especially when I saw the careers that it had led them towards, the doors that had opened for my friends. I always felt that I couldn't have the skills to do a job that I could be passionate about. The idea of working in psychology or well-being, of going to work every day and making a real difference, just seemed so out of reach for someone like me. Now, I did well in various jobs, still fighting mental illness. I learned how to put on an act. I was the extrovert, the hard worker, the life of the party, and I got noticed. I was encouraged, do more, do better. And I did really want to, because I wanted to prove to myself and others that I was better than the voices in my head were telling me. But looking back, the main fault in this plan was that I was missing all of those fundamental life skills we need. So I may have learned how to read a sales report or lead a team or manage a publication, but I didn't know how to cope with the stress and the isolation that came with each promotion, each move, each tiny bedsit and each lonely town. Now, eventually everything came to a head. I truly felt that there was just no place for me, no place in the world. I asked for help one last time, and I was lucky enough to receive inpatient support. And one of the things that the support staff encouraged was reflecting on not only how we had got to those devastating places we were in, but what we needed to do to change to get ourselves out. And it wasn't a change that anyone else could do for us. So that was the stepping stone for me to look back at my dreams of higher education and working within the field of well-being and mental health. And luckily, I just moved back home and I discovered that there was a local university college hybrid at Coventry, and they run degree courses without exams. And they teach in a way that's much more accessible to me, where it's one module at a time. So I'm currently studying for a degree in public health and community studies. But first I had to do a foundation course in health, education and well-being to make up for those missing A-levels. Now, returning to education in your 30s is terrifying. On my first day, I was so nervous. I entered a large classroom full of voices, no tutor to be seen.
The noise was incredibly intimidating, but somehow not as much as the groups of teenagers looking straight at me. I think they thought I was the tutor. They all seemed so unreachable. They were so young. They were cool. They were clever. And in my head, I was none of those things. So I grabbed a seat at the back, then found that I couldn't read the whiteboard and had to awkwardly shuffle to the front, where I sat with a few others. The teacher eventually joined us, immediately told us how hard the course would be, and the module began. I was too scared to say a word. I didn't learn my neighbour's name for another 3 weeks. I didn't learn who else was on my row until the next semester. I came home and I sobbed to my parents that first day. No one spoke to me. They want me to write a report. What's a report? I need to know PowerPoint. I can't do this. It was really tough. Every day I was waiting for the course leader to tell me they'd made a mistake, that I should go home, that I wasn't clever enough to be there, that I was too old, that I was too late. When I look back at that first day, some of my worries could have been addressed with a few baby steps. An introduction to the course. No assumption that we all have the same digital skills from the start. Someone telling us beforehand what a class would look like, what a lecture was, what seminar meant, let alone colloquium. It's thinking about who is being taught, not just what is being taught. But even more helpful, more impactful, would have been if we'd just been given 10 minutes at the beginning to go around the room, say who we were and why we were there. Just 10 minutes to connect, to breathe, and to reassure ourselves that we belonged. Which brings me on to creating connections. Encouraging connection, I believe, is where you can really enhance a student's well-being. You have the power already to create an engaging and dynamic learning environment, encouraging positivity through games, humour, healthy competition, bringing fun into the classroom, but more importantly, you're taking the focus off the fear. When I think about the first day of my degree course, that was very different. I walked into the classroom and the tutor was already there and said, "Hello. Please don't underestimate the importance of this." We introduced ourselves and were shown a list of 8 or 9 icebreaker questions, and we just had to pick one to answer. This is far more relaxing than having to think on the spot, and the answers were only as personal as we wanted them to be. So friendships began from day one, simply based upon people liking the same computer game, or following the same sports team, or, in my case, as both being terrified of spiders. Now, because I was studying public health, conversations around mental and physical health came up naturally. And while we weren't forced to disclose, and most of us didn't, just demonstrating our understanding and empathy towards mental health disorders almost instantly changed the culture of the class. After those discussions, we seemed to relax more and began to connect with each other, to understand that none of us were perfect, none of us are infallible, and even those who seemed confident on the outside also completely understood what it felt like to be anxious. We stopped questioning our differences and began to appreciate our similarities. See, I believe that what happens in the classroom doesn't always have to be academic-based. We've changed a lot about our lives to come to university, and when we step into that classroom, we aren't just there to learn a topic. We're there to start a whole new chapter of life, and that needs more than just lectures and textbooks. We need to know how to walk into a workplace on day one and conquer our nerves. Understand how to say hello to strangers, how to connect. We need the confidence to own up if we don't understand something, and the belief that if we do ask questions, we won't be laughed at or told off. But crucially, we need to learn how to manage our time, how to say yes to opportunities without drowning under the workload, how to prioritise self-care and why. We need to know how to support our and others' well-being. Supporting mental well-being at university isn't always about discussing poor mental health or raising awareness with banners and free pens. It's about championing positive well-being, positive mental health, and keeping that momentum going. And sometimes that can be done in a really subliminal way. Mental health, positive and negative, is incredibly personal, and one person's experience of a diagnosed condition can appear very different to another. For me, one of the ways that my anxiety shows is through perfectionism. I depend on rigid structures, the need for control, the hatred of change. I have a constant belief that I'm not good enough, so that I need to be perfect. Now, I didn't disclose my mental health background to my tutors, but one of them took the time to talk to me one day about how harsh I was on myself when I got essay feedback, or got a question wrong in class, or got upset if plans changed last minute. They pointed out what my perfectionism was doing to me. Now, before this, I'd always thought perfectionism was a fantastic trait. It was something I would happily roll out in job interviews as a reason to hire me. But I didn't realise how much it was holding me back. All of my energy was going into doing everything right, and believing my version of right was the only version, and why wasn't everyone else doing it my way too? Over time, I have become more flexible in my approach. I've learnt to understand that people are different, and they're not going to fit into my idea of perfect teaching or perfect management, and that sometimes my way wasn't always the right way, or at least the only way. And being forced, strongly encouraged to do group work, challenged this way of thinking too. The one thing that all humans hate is when decisions are taken away from us. Think back to the last time that you were told exactly how you were going to do something, how you're going to deliver something, plan something, regardless of what you thought might work best. How did you feel? We've all been there, but by embracing co-creation, you can prevent this feeling for your students. You could empower the shyest, motivate the most disengaged, and support inclusivity simply by asking more questions. Co-creation doesn't have to mean fancy online tools. Often it's just nice to be asked for feedback. What do we want to cover in the session? Which platforms would we like to use? Which do we find difficult? Knowing our opinions are being heard, seeing the results, hearing others acknowledge and agree with us or debate our ideas undoubtedly improves our engagement and our well-being. It lets us know that our opinion is valid. As I've said, a lot of my issues and my mental health conditions, and many mental health conditions, are based around control. And sometimes too much control can be really dangerous. So having that control challenged, being taught how to rethink, how to adapt, and how to consider alternatives, that is life-changing. Education has a lifelong effect on all of us, and the curriculum is central to that. So that is where teaching, learning, and assessment must consider mental health and well-being. TASO's report suggests that the right interventions will make the student journey much easier to navigate, allowing so many people to reach their potential the first time around. And they can also support those like me who had a few false starts. My confidence has increased so much over the past few years. I went from being the quietest person in the room to the one who won't shut up, someone who refused to leave her house for months, to the person standing here in London in front of you today. Although I still fight my mental health disorders every day, the encouragement, the belief, the empowerment that I've experienced during higher education has helped me to believe that I can do this. I do belong here, and it's truly never too late to start again. Thank you for listening.
Thank you all, that was so fab. I think we have about 15 minutes questions. So I would think maybe let's exit this because I think we were getting questions up on the screen before. But I would invite both our online audience and anyone in the room to reflect on questions. Online audience, feel free to just drop them in the chat box as they occur to you. And I will start by kicking off with a question for the panel, but then please also I'll open it to the floor. So have a little think about what you would like to cover. Oh yeah, okay. Do we have to hold it? Okay. Well, based on our, sorry, I'm trying to work out where the best angle is. Based on our own research and the report, it seems like there's a bit of a debate about the extent to which universities should invest in kind of universal support or provide more targeted provision. I was really interested on both your own experience and the work that you do. So I'd just be interested to know kind of what each of you thinks about the extent to which universities should kind of take one road or the other. I'll come to you first, Cassie, if that's all right.
Sure. That's a good question, to be fair. It's quite hard because obviously we know we've got limited resources. My go-to answer would always be you have to invest in both, like, you know, targeted support and also universal support. I think it's tough because the university landscape kind of changes every single cohort, but one thing I loved about you kind of picked up on that co-creation, and I think if it was possible for universities to kind of understand the needs of their specific cohort and what specific students are kind of needing, like which certain populations at their university need extra support, I guess that's one way to kind of tailor it specifically to the university, because not every, and one thing we found is not every university, not every back student kind of needs back student support, for example. But sometimes universities haven't really done the research to kind of understand whether or not their student population needs it. So I'd probably say, yeah, both, but yeah, tailored that way.
Thank you. I would say that did we have all the resources in the world, I think everybody would agree it would be amazing to give every student tailored support, individual to what they're struggling with at that time. I doubt that anyone has that at the moment. And I think that what we're missing is the focus on preventative support, because that can be generalised, that can be for all students, to prevent any student getting to the stage where they need that more tailored support because they're in crisis. So if it's a case of where do we put the resource, I would always say the generalised but early stage.
I love this question. So one of it's very, very clear from public health, occupational health evidence throughout is that you have to do both. And there's always going to be lots of things that you're already doing just through the way you're doing it, because the way things developed were because they were in response to something else that, like, over the decades that you've been doing this, that will be good things to do. There'll also be a whole lot of things that you're doing that have an impact that you hadn't really realised and that you could quite easily tweak that could have a big, big difference across lots of different people. So that preventative bit. But the best organisations, the best places, in terms of nations, in terms of cities, in terms of local authorities, in terms of companies, big and small, they have a plan that looks at promotion, the things they do to actively keep people well. The things that they do are preventative, that are slightly more at risk. So you can see this simply in a hospital where if you're in ICU when COVID hit, you wear full PPE. But if you're on a quiet unit working on admin, you don't need that full kit. That is the difference between at risk and that's targeting. And then you've got the people who are in treatment, and that's where you're sort of helping people who have fallen off in some ways. There's some sort of crisis, and you need a plan for all of that. And where we see the benefits in terms of both well-being and performance, it's where that is integrated across both universal and targeted. And what you'll find is there's loads of things that you're doing that really make a big difference that you probably hadn't realised were well-being things. The other thing is that we need to be really quite ruthless on terms of time and cost and effectiveness, actually, because there's lots of things that sound like a great idea, but are they? And are you just getting feedback because people like it, or does it actually work? And I think I was expecting to come into the university space and find a really rigorous approach to this because we love research, right? But actually that wasn't translating over from the faculties, who were brilliant at this, to the way we were running the organisation, or it was in pockets. And that's not everywhere, right? That's an overview. But I think that could be shifted in this context because you've got that understanding of how it should be done well.
Do you want to answer? No. No. If I know some reflections from the report. Does anyone, the audience, run over with this? Oh no, then I'll have to.
Thank you. This is I've never had a microphone quite like this before. Can I just start by saying I've heard Nakasi and Elizabeth talk before, but every single time I hear them, it's amazing. So thank you both so much for sharing your stories. I'd really like to follow. I think that question is such a good starting point. But I guess then my question follows onto the research that we can do out of that. And I know you talked a lot about your type 3 evidence and the need for kind of looking at causal relationships. But I think actually in what everybody's just said there, it emphasises the complexity of doing that. Because if we're looking at the whole institution approach, if we're looking at the whole university approach, that's really hard to do from a causal perspective, because actually, as Nancy was just saying, you can tweak one thing, it might make a difference, but how do you know that it's tweaking that thing and not the fact that something else has been tweaked that's actually made the difference? So I suppose my question is about how do we balance the research quality in looking at those more individually focused interventions with really good quality evidence when it comes to the whole institution approach? Because I think one of the really important points in your report, which I think is so true, is that we're lacking really good research evidence evaluating that kind of whole institution approach, which obviously is at the heart of what UK are promoting, at the heart of what Student Minds are promoting with the University Mental Health Charter. But how do we get the evidence for that, and how do we show which bits are working over others? Thanks.
Thank you. Slightly awkward role. I'll answer very quickly from the perspective of TASO. I think one of the gaps in the research, particularly as Sarah mentioned in relation to the report, was understanding the impact, and particularly kind of that type 3 evidence for more targeted interventions. And so I think there's a kind of a clear need to build the evidence base kind of from the bottom up to some extent. And then once you have kind of built, I guess once you have a kind of more solid evidence base to reflect on, you can start to look at the kind of institution as a whole and kind of work out how different components interact, I guess. But I still think that there are quite fundamental gaps in terms of the kind of more granular interventions that universities might be using. There you go, yeah.
So this was a discussion when we looked at the review of reviews. So things that have been researched were almost slightly easier to research. There were before and after studies, and you added a control. It was really great. What we realised is that there were some interventions, like where you had universities joining up across a city and connecting with systems, like the NHS, for example. How do you evaluate that? And where there needed to be collaboration on methodological development to enable that research to happen more systematically, to look at that, and actually some of the data that was available across the different systems was quite exciting. And so there are some data projects in that space. But understanding how we make the best use of that research and evaluation budget is also really important. There is 0 point evaluating a mindfulness intervention right now, actually, unless you're doing a really quite complicated multi-arm trial at scale. So where is it useful to do individual studies, and where is it useful to add to the evidence base in a robust way? So that's one of the things I would be really quite careful about, making sure we're putting that research money into the things at the right scale, because actually some of these things we are building up from preclinical, like really observational type research upwards.
Do we have any comments from the online audience? Do you want the mic?
So Chad is asking if the panel recommend any particular KPIs or metrics for them to work towards.
Did you guys hear that? KPIs and metrics. Does anyone want to come in on that?
I will.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm dominating. So the national stats on well-being, which is different to, and there's mental health measures and there's mental well-being measures. I would recommend, if you starting with something that is well established that we know about, and so we can get some consistency in that metric work. So Wellcome Trust are doing some brilliant work harmonising metrics so that we know we're comparing like with like, or if you're choosing something else, you know why you're choosing something else. But getting that control group across is much easier when we've got some benchmarks that we can do from national data. So that's part of the reasons why I would look to those established measures. There are some challenges, I think, and that you picked up actually in the report about male mental health, actually. And there are differences in the way
male and female are answering those questions in terms of it's not picking up some of the challenges around male mental health. And I think we need to look in more detail about what metrics are useful. And actually that takes us to some of the disclosure comments. Actually, in the workplace, we realised that actually disclosure wasn't a particularly helpful measure or helpful metric to track, because lots of people don't disclose for really great reasons. And where people do, that's great, we can do wholesome things around it. But actually some of those more broad indicators about how people are doing generally are much more useful at understanding where people are doing well or not. So there's a couple of things in there. Use robust measures that are practiced unless you know what you're doing. Look at the broader measures, not just mental health diagnosis and disclosure, because actually that tells you how people are doing. But also we need to look at male mental health in particular to really understand what's going on a bit more.
Do you have any reflections, Sarah, on the HE outcome? That being a gap at the moment.
Yeah, so obviously I think we've already mentioned it before in the report that there's just a real lack of long-term outcomes. So I think it's an encouragement really for providers to not just track well-being and mental health outcomes, but also these sort of longer-term outcomes in terms of courses. So how are students then doing in terms of attainment? Where are they going on to in terms of postgraduate and graduate outcomes, and also looking at dropout rates as well, because we know that's the most sort of severe outcome in terms of mental health issues is dropping out of HE. So it's really important to track those measures as well and include those as well as sort of well-being and mental health measures.
Thanks. I'd actually like to come back in on the point around disclosure. That came out of the research as one of the challenges in that particularly certain groups, so male students and possibly kind of black and ethnic minority students, don't report mental health concerns to the same rate as other students. And that is a possible area that you could think about kind of trying to support certain groups to indicate that they have kind of mental health concerns, that to flag that kind of at an earlier stage. So that the right support could be in place. And be really interested to hear the panel's reflections on kind of whether more could be done there. Can I hand over to you?
Sure. Yeah, disclosure is always a really tough one for me. I think based on the research, like my PhD research and also the research with Black Students Talk, I think a lot of the kind of feel is that what's the point of disclosing, because they won't be able to help me anyway, you know, like you know that there's only white counsellors, so what's the point? Or there's a massive mistrust within the institution, and I think one thing that we kind of miss with universities is that university is one institution that students are kind of dealing with, but students are also dealing with other institutions like welfare institutions or social services or police, or like there's so many institutions that they've kind of experienced institutional racism in, and university is just another institution that is racist. So there's a massive kind of mistrust and kind of knowledge that the universities aren't really tailored to support them. So yeah, there's a big thing about what's the point. There's also kind of a thing that in terms of disclosing, the interesting thing about like who you're disclosing to. So you might disclose to your friends and you might disclose to family, and they feel that they're better equipped to kind of support them. So I think there's also like a massive miss in terms of what disclosing is and what that means. And also one thing also that's kind of come up is that Black students talk to each other quite a lot, because you know you might be the only one in your classroom and you kind of seek out other Black students from other courses and stuff, and a lot of misinformation does end up happening that way. There's a lot of beauty in Black student communities, but there's a lot of kind of, you know, students who are further along in their journey will talk to the younger ones and kind of share the experiences which are true, but it does end up meaning that Black students kind of don't feel safe, and it might not be because they've experienced their own level of unsafety because they might not have interacted, but there's that kind of second-hand trauma that happens when you kind of share those racist experiences in services. So it's quite a complex question.
I agree with everything that you've said. What I would say is I think sometimes, even with the best intention, there can be a bit of pressure put on people to disclose, and to disclose in the way that the university wants them to. So it could be, come to our secret private group of support and disclose everything that's happening to you. And that's an amazing service for those who need it, but that won't change the narrative about it's okay, safe and normal to disclose. And I think by making classrooms in particular safe spaces from day one, where it's just a general normal understanding that if you come in and you're having a bad day, you can say that. If you're struggling at home because of something, you can talk about that, and that's not, doesn't have to always be a very private, very serious conversation. It can just make it more generalized and make it safer for people.
I think that's it.
I think we have time for one more question from the floor, probably. Yes.
Thank you. I was just wondering, Sarah, Cassie, you mentioned peer support, possibly technology moderated, and I'm wondering how you feel about that. Can it be effective? What kind of role can it play, particularly thinking in terms of supporting students' progression both through university and then into careers following that?
Thank you. Do you want to come in on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think for the Black Students Talk, it used to be in person, and they really loved the in-person kind of connection because there used to be pizza and food, and it was great. And then kind of when we had to go online, at first I think there was a bit of a skepticism, but I think the beauty of being able to do it online is, kind of being able to connect with those students who are, remote parts of England or remote parts of Scotland, somewhere up north. I think the benefit of having that online presence is really important and really helpful. It's really interesting, the thing about the career progression, because one thing we do at Black Students Talk is we kind of utilize our connections that we have as Black students, like across the UK, in terms of like with career people who are already kind of left university and have their careers, and we've had some people come in and just like talk to our students and kind of bring in their like what they've learned and how they've kind of got through university and what they were taught, some of those like sharing of resources and knowledge. So that's been really helpful, because I don't think we would have been able to do it in person, because they have busy lives, but they were willing to kind of come online for 30 minutes, which wouldn't have been possible without technology, without kind of everything moving in that direction. So I think technology definitely plays like being online plays a really vital role to connecting students. And because the one thing I liked about your presentation was that idea of like social like connectedness. I think that's because they don't really feel like they have that in the in-person space in university. We can create that online, and they can then bring that into the university space. So yeah, it's been helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, really great question. I mean, obviously Nakasi has got a whole lot more experience in terms of on the ground, what it looks like to combine sort of online, and obviously part of it was probably forced online due to the pandemic. But I think what we're learning obviously from the pandemic as a whole is that blended approaches are working the best. So at the moment, we have a real lack of evidence, strong causal evidence and long-term evidence of what it's actually working. So that's obviously an area we need to increase. But I think obviously in terms of being more wide-reaching and reaching more marginalised group, it's great that there's online opportunities as well. And it's great to hear with Black Students Talk that it's sort of become this national effort, and students from different universities are talking, not necessarily within the same institution. So it obviously means it's a more sort of wide-reaching approach. And there is evidence to suggest that online networks, virtual networks that emulate sort of group therapy processes are really helpful. So it doesn't need to be in person. But I think, there needs to be a bit of both. Sort of this online network is great when students are perhaps in their holidays as well, is really important. and for sort of maintaining connections after uni, like you were saying, with sort of alumni. But I imagine, and I'm sure Nakasi can sort of say this more than me, is that you need this sort of face-to-face connection, in-group connection as well for it to really, really work.
I think this is an area that could benefit greatly from a what works approach, but broader than just the HE sector, because peer support is something that's done in multiple settings, and there is a lot of learning that could be done very, very quickly about what's happening in this context, which bits work for whom, when, how, and for how much, because what we also see is different sectors prefer different approaches, and sometimes group-based approaches are often done in the public sector and voluntary sector versus other types of approaches in different other organisations. And that's fine, it's usually cost-driven. But actually there's a cost to time. And if you're wanting to make sure that people are putting their time, is it better to put your time into study skills or a peer support group in different ways? Is it better to do it in person or online? And we can see from the learning research, for example, that there are things that work for knowledge transfer online, absolutely fine, but there's other things that you get in groups that are better. So actually, if we can get that level of sophistication, we can just use it way smarter. But this is an area, one of the promising approaches, for example, that Wellcome Trust were looking at peer support for young adults in the workplace. So I think this is something that is not just you on your own. I think this is something we could learn pretty quickly about which things are good for which contexts and why you're doing it. So is it because it's you're meeting people who, from your that you identify with, you can see a career that's for you that you might not be able to access if you were, I don't know, in one part of the country and that person's in, I don't know, in India or in another country altogether. So you can get that different bit that's online. Or is it about meeting people and building those social connections? And the relationship effect is really big. So you need to be careful. Is it the relationship that's making people feel better, because it just does, or is it the thing that's happening around it that's making, is it working as well? So just unpicking it a bit, I think, could be done quite quickly at scale across multiple sectors.
I'll be very quick. I just wanted to add that when it comes to peer-to-peer support, when you've got students talking to other students, obviously there's the amazing social side of it, and that is something that we should definitely encourage. But please just make sure that the students who are supporting students are being supported themselves, because that can be quite dangerous. So.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for being quick, because we are, I think, over time. Thank you so much to everyone who came in person today and to our online audience. That was such an interesting session. From TASO's perspective, the next steps will be to look at how we can support the generation of evidence. So kind of watch this space, keep tabs on our website. We will be putting more information out there about kind of our plans in this area. And I think that will include some of the questions that came up earlier around kind of supporting the development of kind of KPIs or kind of key outcome measures for the sector. But most of all, thank you to our panel. I found that so interesting. All kind of gave really interestingly different perspectives on the whole experience of kind of mental health in HE. So please join me in a round of applause.